Welcome everyone to the latest webinar for Hired Power. This webinar series is called Knowledge is Power, and it is an educational webinar series on addiction and recovery. Today, we are joined by a panel of esteemed professionals to discuss the topic, Safe Passage from Here to There. This is a conversation on how you, your loved one, or your client can safely transition between levels of care within the treatment continuum. I am excited to introduce you to our three esteemed speakers, starting out with our very own Nanette Zumwalt, who you likely already know as the CEO of Hired Power, but she's also recognized as one of the top interventionists and an industry expert, both nationally and internationally. She has been working in the field of mental health and addiction treatment for going on 3 decades and has a pioneering role in clinically supporting adolescents, young adults, and adults during the high risk and critical transition periods of recovery. We are also joined by Patrick Barrasso, the founder and chief executive officer of Imbalance Continuum of Care. He is a noted psychotherapist with over 30 years of extensive training and experience in adolescent and adult substance abuse and mental health treatment. His vast experience makes him a frequent presenter at both local and national conferences, and he sits on a number of committees in the industry. Lastly, we are excited to welcome Carson Parker, who is a therapeutic education consultant based in Indianapolis. She is a professional member of IECA and founded her consulting practice, Carson Parker Consulting, in 2019 after working in the behavioral health and addiction fields for over 20 years. She specializes in therapeutic placements for kids, adolescents, young adults, and students with learning differences. Carson is a member of National Charity League and sits on the board of the Primary Care Psychiatric Foundation. So without further ado, I will hand it off to Nanette. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Emily, and welcome to everyone today. I'm really excited about this topic. I think it's an important topic when we're talking about treatment, both for addiction and mental health recovery. And so I'm really excited. Patrick, you and I have been friends for decades. And I feel like I've kind of grown up together in this industry. And Carson, we've worked together the last couple of years and really learned to respect each other's work and process of how we deal with families. So thank you both so much for being here today. Safe passage is an important topic. We've seen some things in the news lately. We've seen some things going in our government about the rights of adolescents, about safe passage. There's questions that we always get about young adults and even adults and who accompanies them safely from the decision of going to treatment to the door of treatment, and how do they get there, and how do we determine the who's and the how's and the why's. So that's what we want to talk about today. That's what I want to lean into both of you and hear your expertise to share with our listeners and our families and professionals that are trying to know more about this. So maybe Patrick, you can start and tell us a little bit about your experience with safe passage, or how our industry terms it, transport of both adolescents and young adults that come to your program.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to be here as well. And of course, I consider you one of my best friends in the field and one of the most competent professionals I've ever worked with. And Carson, obviously, we're glad to be working with you at the Academy, and thank you for that. And glad to see you join the field of competent professionals that have that clinical understanding. So glad to be here. It's interesting, if you ever want to get somebody's attention, back when I was first starting in the field, I was a probation officer. And so we were tasked sometimes with going out of state and flying kids that were being brought back to our state for fairly serious crimes. You talk about transports or safe passage. You want to get a plane's attention, show up with a badge and a child in shackles, both leg and hand shackles, and we always had to fly commercially. So I am very grateful that the field has evolved, and although I think in the court system they still have to do that, but I've seen over the last 30 years a lot of transport safe passage. I am grateful for the opportunity to have young people that are lost and making really, really dangerous decisions, have the opportunity to have trained professionals make sure they get from where they are to where they need to be. And my prayer is that the field evolves and is always there to support families and young people, because without it, young people won't get to where they need to be, and it could have really devastating effects for them as we see the rise in drug overdoses and mental health crisis in our young people. So for the folks that are in this field, including you, Nanette, I am forever grateful that you exist, and we have to do everything in our power to make sure that we evolve the field. Kids are always taken care of, and that we have this opportunity for families and children.
Well said, Patrick. That's a hard note to follow, but Carson, I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you to follow.
Yeah, so I agree. I think there's always families out there that their first question is, how am I going to get my child from my home to the program safely and without incident? I think it's really important to be able to pull in professionals that is their job and that is your expertise, and to be able to really walk parents through and families through what that looks like, and be able to provide, information and experience and share with them kind of what I look for when I, am recommending agencies that do that. Because if they're afraid to get their child there, it just kind of starts that process with a greater challenge. And so I think, the more resources that we can provide families and services that we can provide families, as the industry evolves and changes and we see a greater need, I really appreciate that we've been able to kind of transition into a more family kind of friendly version of transport, and really make sure that parents understand what it's like versus, maybe something they've heard about that either isn't accurate or is, decades ago, how it worked.
Yeah, that brings up so many questions. I have like questions off the top of my head off of that. So one of the things you talked about was adolescents and young adults. And we do have to approach them differently, right? So trying to create agency in both of those areas with adolescents and with young adults, creating buy-in so that they can begin their recovery journey. But definitely a difference, right? With young adults, we're sitting down, we're doing an intervention, we're doing larger family meetings in an effort to get them into agreement and to get them moving forward. And after that, they too usually have a safe passage from those events to the door of treatment. But with adolescents, it's different. So let's talk about that a little bit. How do you find that different with adolescents?
So I definitely get that question a lot from parents. I mean, when I'm working with families, there's always going to be parents that, one, are afraid to be the person that's making a decision. They don't want to be the person that their child could get frustrated or upset with. So I think sometimes they're wanting to hand that control over to sort of pacify their child. And so one thing I always talk to parents about on the front end is, one, assessing the risk on involving the adolescent in the process. And so my preference is always to be able to talk with the child. And, obviously there are scenarios where that's not the safe thing to do because of risk of either self-harm or running or something to that effect. But for those that I can involve in the process, I try to get their buy-in and put them at ease on the front end. And so explaining to parents the difference between, providing them agency and being part of the process versus telling them, here, you get to choose. And so I really start that at the beginning by, getting to know, the identified patient, right away and learn kind of what's important to them and how they're feeling and where they would like things to be as far as changes in their life, so that throughout that process, once we get to the program decision and they find out kind of where they're going, we can say, here's where we listened, and here then is where you're going, so that the parent still has that control and has that boundary of, I've made a decision, here's what that looks like, but we also took you into consideration as far as what you were wanting and wanted you to be part of that conversation.
And
Yeah,
so, go ahead, Patrick.
yeah, if I can.
Yes.
From our end, because as you know, we have the young adult continuum, and we have the academy that specializes in young people that have substance abuse and mental health. And it's super interesting, right? So when we look at my background's in child development. So when we look at executive functioning, we look at an 18 or 19-year-old, and we know that prefrontal cortex is more developed, and certainly drugs and alcohol and lifestyle has inhibited that development. But when we interview a young person, and sometimes they'll be in a program, and they're asking the questions about the medicine being the academy. And often those questions are there girls? Do you allow smoking? Do you allow phone?
Right.
So it's super interesting to note that their executive functioning, and no discredit to those young people, isn't even well developed enough to make the best decision about what medicine they need. Whereas if we skip forward to the young adults, they all choose our young adult program. They all have agency. They're all over 18, so obviously we wouldn't take them if they didn't want to come, because it would inhibit our community. So giving that child at 18 or 19, you just see the difference. I mean, I can tell you we're just good treatment. We don't have a lot of bells and whistles. We're certainly not on the ocean or any of those cool things. And young people are asking the kind of questions that really inform the best medicine more often than not. So I really appreciate the point about young adult versus a 16-year-old.
Right.
The problem sometimes with allowing a 16-year-old to make the decision, and I don't hear either of you saying that, but I think that's a trend that we see, is that then they can undo that decision. And what happens in that? When the therapeutic process gets uncomfortable, when they're looking at issues that are hard to look at, and they say, I want to quit, Mom and Dad, I chose to come here so I can choose to leave. Well, that's not good for anybody, right? So I just wanted to highlight those differences. I've seen that more, kind of handing over. I talk about the reins to a young person who's not quite capable of making those kind of best decisions for his health and welfare.
And that's where I think it's so important, where both of you, all three of us, actually come into the process for these families, is, as Carson said, not only do the families sometimes not want to make that decision, but they don't even know the difference in the decisions. So having professionals that can really lead them into quality, safe, evidence-based programs where they're going to see growth, and really trust that those professionals are going to lead them in the right way, and that there are professionals like our safe passage staff, like our intervention teams, like Carson educational consultants, that can help them when appropriate process and talk about them, so that they create at least a level of willingness to go along, to the center, without it really being their choice that they can then rescind, as you just said, Patrick. So
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah. And in an ideal world, and I know you and Carson share this ideal, when it's possible. One of the first interventions I did, and that was back when, I was a young professional. And the ideal was that this young man, had a coach and had the team there to help guide him and direct him towards making the decision towards treatment. A couple of things that were important about that, right, is that we were able to get him into, at that point, an outpatient clinic. Some young people won't even go to counseling or won't leave their house.
Right.
So it helps us with the decision tree about safe passage, right? So we were able to orchestrate the intervention was phenomenal. In fact, quite controversial, but I made the decision that his drug dealer, which was his cousin, was at the intervention. The family didn't think that was a good idea, but ultimately the cousin said, "You don't want to live the life I'm living and take this intervention." Well, he thanked us and said, "No way, no how." And then after such time of the intervention, about 2.5 hours, then he went to leave and we had safe passage there ready for him to go. His car was left at my outpatient treatment center, only to find out in the trunk of his car was an AK-47 and about a pound of pot. So he was in it thick and I knew that, but he understood, and it's got a great success story. I mean, he went on to get recovery and sobriety and is in business today. But in an ideal world, and I think you both share that, if we could have a family meeting, if a child could understand the totality of their decision making and why the medicine and why the treatment is indicated, most likely they're still not going to go, but they have a better understanding. Now, it's not always ideal, like Carson mentioned. If you were to tell a child sometimes ahead of time, and I've had this happen, they could overdose. Say, "Hey, I know I'm going to treatment, so I'm going to go out and get, just blazed as can be." And that's, I had a kid that did that and had a stroke in the process and was forever disabled. And so lots of stories. So sometimes it's not ideal. You have to really have the element of complete surprise, or you could lose that child in his life. So.
And with the fentanyl, the really high rise that we're seeing in fentanyl, being mixed in so many drugs, right? People think they're smoking a joint and there's fentanyl in there. They think they're taking a tab of Xanax and there's fentanyl in there. So people that don't even know they're taking fentanyl, the risk of going for that one last use, or as you said, I'm going to blow it out of the park before I go, or just, I can't manage my emotions and I'm going to use without it even being a conscious choice. The risks, increase. And I want to back up for a minute, because I think what we didn't do early on, what I didn't do early on, is really explain what a safe passage is, right? So explaining that when young adults and adolescents and adults are on their way to treatment, oftentimes getting there, I kind of feel like it's the Wizard of Oz. There's flying monkeys and witches and poppy seeds and all sorts of risk factors, from the safety of home to the safety of the center in which they're going to. And so sometimes that can be managed by families, and oftentimes it can be managed by families, but oftentimes it cannot. And having professionals, trained professionals, insured, vetted, people who understand how to join a client, understand how to build rapport with a client and safely accompany them to the door of treatment is definitely needed and most often warranted. So I want to talk about that a little bit as we describe what a safe passage is. The industry uses the word transport a lot. I think safe passage sounds like we're dealing with humans in a humane and empathetic situation. But both of you, what is a critical time, or what are the reasons you're going to recommend to a family? I know, Patrick, we talked about this yesterday, and a dad was asking, why would someone else take him other than me? Or is it okay if I take him? How do you guys help a family determine that?
Carson, I'll let you go first if you'd like. And then
Okay, sure.
I've got plenty of ideas about that.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks. So typically when we have that conversation, it is, I think ideally, everyone could benefit from it. honestly, any adolescent, young adult, I think it's incredibly beneficial. I also think there are times where we really have to look at it as being vital. And so typically when I'm kind of making that recommendation to a family is, if you feel like you can't get your child from home to the program safely, if you think they're going to run, if you think they're a risk to themselves or to somebody else, or to do some risky behaviors, or, act out in any way, then that's when it becomes pretty vital. So again, I think a lot of people can benefit from it. I think, also understanding that not everyone will, and when is it crucial and vital. So those are typically the times where I say, this is what we need to do.
Mhm.
And what I'd like to say is there's a couple differences, right? So there's a difference to primary care and in balanced therapeutic boarding at the academy is mainly, obviously therapeutic boarding. So they're typically coming to us from other programs, either wilderness or RTC. And sometimes there's kind of a meandering story, but I think it's important. Sometimes parents will contact me, and maybe you've had this, Carson and Nanette, and they'll say, we're going to bring our kids from, X program, but we're only going to tell them that you're a 2-month program and that you have girls and, this and that. So we're just telling you that in advance. And I'll say, under those circumstances, I apologize, but we can't accept your son, because I always have to believe that we have to be dignified in the way that we work with young people and honest, even if that honesty is going to create a response. So I would never want to start off in my relationship with a young person feeling that I've been dishonest. It's just not who I am. And so the bigger question, Nanette, back to your point, is for families, it's very difficult. It's a very difficult decision from primary care to therapeutic boarding. They miss their child. They want to have interaction with their child, and we fully understand that. So my question is always to this father yesterday, your child is expected to push back against this boundary. That's what his job is. He's anxious. It's a new setting. Children with mental health and substance abuse typically don't transition well. And your ideal of what those 2 days are going to be is probably going to be very different than what the reality is. It's going to be a child that's pushing against that boundary, making you feel guilty, making you feel. So my question is always, is the child prepared? And does the child need a safe passage as opposed to the family? Is the family prepared? And by the end of the conversation, he said, I don't think, as you talk about this, I don't think I could handle it. So the child from door to door is a much more humane experience, because then he takes that those accomplishments in primary and starts off at our program feeling like he's made those gains. And the safe passage has been just a couple folks that are there getting him excited about the program.
And providing that, as you said, they're pushing against the boundaries. So those professionals are providing, they're prepared. And without that emotional connection, right? They have that empathy and compassion. They care about the client, but they're not buried in that emotional tie that families are. So when they get upset, it's easier for them to hold those bumpers, those safe containers in place for them to have those emotions safely and to get from point A to point B.
Yeah, and it's not to say that every child that we have go from primary to the academy. It's about 50-50, Nanette, in terms of parents bringing them, or a brother or a sister, or an uncle, and safe passage. So it's not to say that it doesn't work quite fine in some instances, but back to your process of assessment, like on our end, we'll ask all the right questions. We'll ultimately let the referring professional in the treatment program decide, because they know the child best. So if it was Carson, we we will always say to the family, please go with her recommendation because she's known you much longer than we have. And so it does work out sometimes, but it's really hard on families. And I understand that. It's very hard on families when they see a child digress, which is natural in transition.
Yeah.
So, so how do you identify if you are going to use an agency? How do you screen those agencies and professionals, and how would you identify? I know how I'd identify a trained professional, but how would you identify a trained professional, and how would you screen an agency that you're recommending to a family?
Do you want me to
Yes,
start?
please.
Okay.
Yeah, because we usually just refer to you guys.
So for my screening process, it's really important for me to have personal experience with an agency. And so obviously at some point has to be the first time, right? You can't always, someone has to be the first time using them. But I look a lot at relationships that I have built with the agency and with the staff. I look really closely at what their process is, what their communication is, what the transport staff look like. And I don't mean physically look like, but kind of their experience and what it looks like when you're kind of matching the person or the people doing the safe passage with the client. That's a really important aspect. So those pieces for me are really important. What the communication looks like with the family. I find it important that there's a level of individualization and flexibility. Not that we change up our system or that you do a completely different system every time, but if there's little things that need adjusted that don't deter from the kind of main point of getting an adolescent or young adult from home to program or from program to program, that we really kind of listen and are able to adapt a bit. And also the approach, I think, is probably, I don't know, I feel like a lot of those things are all equal, but I do think it's important that it's a hands-off approach, that adolescents and young adults, but even more so the adolescents, just from the perspective of, since they don't always have a say in things, that they feel like they're part of the process and that something's not being done to them. So, how staff interact, and I think, Nanette, you kind of said a few minutes ago, kind of getting them excited for that next step. I have some great staff that have really gotten the kids excited for where they're going and help them understand what to expect when they get there. And those things for me are really important because parents really respond well to that. I think it allows the adolescent and the family to be bought in and move more quickly and transition more smoothly into a program. So those for me are a lot of the really important pieces when I am making that referral. I mean, I have 3 kids of my own, and I have a couple, well, they're all teens, 2 are adults now, but that process of would I do this with my own child? Would I, make this decision for myself? And that's sort of kind of always my final kind of decision when looking at options.
Yeah. And I think it's important that we talk about, what creates a professional. So we're always looking, we always want to have a gender specific individual within the team. With adolescents, we're always looking at 2 professionals. With young adults, we could be looking most often 1 to accompany them, but sometimes 2, depending on the emotional regulation, the acuity of the situation. And it's important, as you said, using a hands-off approach. We don't put hands on unless there's an extreme emergency. We don't use any type of restraints. And so it's having that skill, that training. All of our staff are certified counselors, recovery specialists. They've been through training. They understand motivational interviewing. They understand communication style, and therefore they can join in and build rapport and relationship with that client so they can get them excited, so that they do feel safe, and that the family feels safe with their loved one going with these professionals. So I really believe in certification. I really believe in a lot of training that allows staff to join in and create rapport with the client. I very much believe in having a gender specific staff, regardless of the situation, because there's bathroom stops, there's lots of things that happen along the way. And then again, also that there's a level of an agency, a company that has liability insurance, that has workman's compensation, that has these things that create standards, professional standards and ethics that create a professional that you can count on, versus just hiring some people, some random people to do this. So
Yeah, and I would say we if there's a referring professional, then we're going to let them be the expertise on safe passage. I can tell you through just a brief story what not to do, and it has a happy ending. But these two guys transported a child. These are the things I would look for. They didn't. They were referred by somebody else. They weren't curious about our program, so they didn't have any information about us, which raised the young person's level of anxiety. So he was asking all along, like, do they have this? Do they have that? We don't know. Kind of be quiet. They were in the airport in a big city. It had been a long night and they fell asleep. So that's probably what not to do.
the staff fell asleep?
Yeah, the staff fell asleep, and
Yeah,
he mentions that they ultimately kind of denied it, but it turned out to be true. And he left, and he went out into, it was on the outskirts of a big city, and he wanted to get high, which is not unusual for the people that we serve. And he made a decision. He was scared, and he was lost, and he was questioning his decision. So he came back to the airport, was sitting outside, bummed a cigarette from a lady. And so they smoked a cigarette together, and he told her his story. And she said, well, I really think you ought to go to the program. And this is completely a true story. And so she gets on our website. She calls our main office. I'm in the car with my wife, Betsy, who works with me and does all admissions. They call the ranch, they put them through to us, and this kid's on the phone. We thought we were being tricked. And the kid's like, can I still come to your program? I'm like, where are your transports, or what's happening? I thought he was tricking us. And he said, they've gone, but this lady works for the airline, and she's going to get me a ticket, and I'll be there at 10 o'clock, whatever the time was. Me and Betsy weren't far from the airport. We pulled over, had lunch, and picked him up. And he made the decision to come. Now, I share that story, and he thinks of her today, and that was 10 years ago, honestly, as an angel that led him to a place of treatment, right? And I believe in that kind of stuff. So I think she probably was an angel. And what I would say about that is, so I want to look for people that are curious about what our program's about. How can they answer those questions for a young person? How can they be honest? I don't want to transport company that's giving them cigarettes and donuts and just tell them, everything they want to hear. So I just feel like you always have to be dignified, like I said earlier, in the way that we show up for young people. And so I'm looking for that. I'm looking for honesty. I'm looking for them knowing the program so they can start getting a child, if not excited, at least understanding the program. And I want them to be dignified in the way that they show up. I don't want our kids, we don't allow smoking at the academy. I don't want a kid smoking a pack of cigarettes. So the first The first time that we get to see him, he's already in some sort of agitated detox state. So that's a little bit of a story about maybe what not to do. Certainly don't fall asleep. And you know, when talking to the guys, they said he was a cool kid. We saw no risk, but they did deny that they had fallen asleep. And I believed him, actually. You know, obviously he ended up in our program.
Yeah, and obviously he ended up out in the city alone. So if they were awake, how did he manage to be out there smoking a cigarette with this woman? You know, we have a protocol of eyes on and arm's length. So if your eyes on and arm's length, they don't make it outside smoking cigarettes with you know, angels. So how do you talk to families to, you know, we talked about a little bit, Patrick, about how you broach the subject, but what about when they have concerns? How are you reassuring them that they can get their loved one? I think that's the biggest thing I hear is, I don't know how I'm going to get Johnny or Sally there. They're not going to go. You know, their experience in their home, their experience with their loved one has not been good. Like you said, they can't even get them to a therapist's office. So how are you talking to them about the possibility of getting their loved ones to your centers, or to the centers you're sending them to, Carson?
So part of the conversation I always have is I start with, you know, understanding what their concerns are, what their fears are about it, so that I can make sure that's what I'm addressing, so that I'm not addressing something that maybe they haven't even thought of and they're like, oh no, that's another reason. So I kind of start with that, and then really just talk to them about, you know, again, kind of decreasing their anxiety by making sure they have as much information about the process as possible. And so, you know, making sure that, you know, when I'm making that call and kind of looping an agency in, that they're learning as much about the parents and the child as possible, making sure that they're really informed on what the process looks like. Making sure I always share different experiences and stories. And I think that for me really lends itself a lot to parents. I think that helps them kind of understand in maybe more of a kind of everyday situation what that looks like. But I want to make sure that, you know, one thing I always talk with parents about is, you know, who's the kind of subject matter expert in each area. And so, you know, your child better than I know your child. I know the therapeutic program world better than you do. And then if it comes to kind of safe passage and that sort of thing, you know, here are the people that are experts in that. And so I'm putting my trust in them. You've put your trust in me. And so that we can kind of build that collaboration and really do that kind of warm handoff as far as making sure they know, like, here's who's going to call you from the agency. Here's how long I've known them. Here's how long I've worked with them. Here's what they're going to do, and kind of just make sure that we kind of walk alongside them through that process. And I think that really de-escalates a lot of their anxiety and fears when they understand what the benefits are after they've gotten kind of past what their fears kind of are about making that decision.
And Nanette, I would say that from my perspective, what I have kind of helped families understand, and for every child that comes to the academy over the last, now going into our 19th year, I welcome them and kind of give them a welcome to the academy, and I'm glad you're here, and I'm here to help you. And I will ask them briefly to tell me their story. And I'm not here to discount that for some children, it's traumatic to be transported. I'm not here to discount that at all. But in the 1,900 kids I've spoken to, maybe 2, and I'm not exaggerating, that have been transported to primary care, it sticks out for them, because mostly they're like, look, man, I was high, you know, most of the time. These guys came in, I'm like, cool, I'm gonna go, I know I'm in trouble, and I need help. And so ultimately, when I talk to young people, and a lot of the young people I talk to are like, hey man, can you let my transporter know that I'm doing well? And like that guy, Charlie, he was amazing. And he really helped me. And so even with the, for the populations that we work with, which are primarily substance abuse and mental health, those kids don't register that as a real, they just know they wouldn't have gone any other way. And they tell me that, like, there's no way I would have gone with my parents. There's no way I would have gone anywhere else. So yes, it's hard to make that decision. And for a parent, it's probably more traumatic than for a child. But ultimately they have some understanding that without that safe passage, I've literally had kids say that I'd probably be dead right now. So.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point with the parents. Tracy, who runs our Safe Passage department at Higher Power, she works extensively with the families before the Safe Passage, during the Safe Passage, and after. And she is keeping them in communication, what's going on, if there's flight delays, if there's, car trouble, all these random things that can happen, especially as we're traveling today, right? During the pandemic, the weirdest travel stories happen. But she's communicating with them, and we're getting notes and letters and pictures, and families that are calling back, 3, 6, 9 months later to tell Tracy how their loved one's doing, to tell her how their family's doing, because there is a connection, an intense connection that happens for the kids. Most often they're asking, can I give you a hug? Will I see you again? Are you going to come back? Will you come back and pick me up? But the families are having that same sense of relief and that same bonding experience through the process. And I think that that's really important to share, that it's on both sides.
Yeah, I agree. I actually had a young man that asked his mom if they would hire transport to come back and take him from Wilderness to the school just so that he could see them and have the same guys again. Yes. Yeah. She was like, okay. So
we have a young man that from Toronto, Canada, and he's one of my favorite kids in the whole world, but he went on to get certified and worked for my late friend Bill Lane, and became a Safe Passage ambassador, and really took pride in the way that he spoke to young people about recovery. Started a young people's meeting in Toronto, which was hard to do at the time, and that was 14 years ago. And so he'd say, hey, Patrick, just want to tell you that, I helped save another life. And I'm like, man, that's amazing, kid. So he went on to make that his life's passion. So a couple things, when I talk about I pray for Safe Passage, that continues to evolve and become the professional field that we need so bad. And I continue to pray that referring professionals thrive and do well, because we bring up the point of how do you choose, and Carson becomes the expert for families, and she will do the legwork in terms of how to decipher good programs from bad programs, and her and her colleagues. And I think all of us work so importantly together that we both have, all three of us have to continue to support each other's fields as we have been.
I agree.
Yeah. So I know we have some questions that have been put out there, so I want to take some time to address some of them. I think you touched on this earlier, both of you. An anonymous attendee is asking, what are the advantages versus disadvantages of telling a child and or young adult ahead of time?
So I'll speak to the child, and then certainly Carson can go. That young adults, I'm not as equipped in primary care, right? Because we are transitional living for them. So they always, are known that they're going to come to us, and they'll call my son Daniel and talk about the program. But the adolescents, the advantage sometimes can be that they have a better understanding of where they're going and what's needed to accomplish, and it reduces their anxiety. The disadvantage that I spoke to earlier, depending on how far down the rabbit's hole a child is, their anxiety could be increased to such a degree because they don't want to lose what's familiar to them in terms of drugs and alcohol and their lifestyle. They know they want out of it, but they're afraid to lose it. Their anxiety can become so overwhelming, they act out in really big ways, either self-harm or copious amounts of drug use. I see that as the biggest disadvantage. So it's really about knowing your child, relying on the trained professionals. Sometimes that's just an outpatient therapist, not just an outpatient therapist, but an outpatient therapist you've been working with, and knowing their level of emotional dysregulation, anxiety that may be increased by telling them ahead of time that they're going to primary care.
Mm-hmm. Carson?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think it definitely, both things you said, I think are fairly accurate as far as kind of the advantages and disadvantages. And I think, yeah, definitely looking at any professionals that you've been working with, if it's, therapist, family therapist, whoever can kind of work with you to kind of provide support and kind of answer that question for you, and then, or with you, I should say. And then for a young adult, yeah, once you're 18, you make the decision. So they always know in advance.
Even with an intervention, I do a lot of interventions. Obviously, young adults are a large percentage of that group that needs support and education to make that decision. But even with them, I talk to the families about, has anyone spoken to them about the option of treatment before the intervention? Has this been broached by a therapist, by the family members? And if not, I encourage them to initiate that conversation. An intervention is a presentation of a plan. And so, initiating that conversation, you'd be surprised how often when a parent sits down with them, and sometimes with the support of a therapist or a grandparent, and says, this is what's going on, and we really want to get you help. I've heard the young adult say, what took you so long? Mm-hmm. Or, oh, yes, I have to go. My life is a mess. Mm-hmm. So always want to use the least restrictive and create an opportunity for them to agree before the professionals have to come in with other measures. So I think that, even the adolescents, sometimes they don't need to know the when or the where, mm-hmm. but even understanding that these behaviors are leading them in that direction, having that conversation that this is a possibility. If these behaviors continues, help them get to those healthier decisions faster. Yeah. Okay, we have another question. What do we think on a parent accompanying the professional on a safe passage, a parent or a family member? What do we think about that?
I can speak to that just briefly, but I'm not the expert. But I know that there are interventionists for young people that may choose to do the intervention and then have a family member accompany them on the transport. In the experiences that I've had, it's worked out quite well. It could be an uncle, it could be a grandparent. And I think, again, I'm not the expert on that, but I know that in the situations where we've had it, it's actually worked out pretty awesome. Then they can report back to the parent, program solid, campus is beautiful, and it gives them some reassurance. So that I don't have a vast amount of experience. So that's all I got.
Yeah, we often get that question a lot. Can mom go with the professional instead of two staff, or can dad go with the professional, or Uncle Johnny or grandpa? And it is an individual case by case. And most often, if a family member can go, if the client if there is a safe opportunity for that to happen, I agree with you. It reassures everybody and has worked well in our history as well. And we'll screen it out if we think that there's concern. You know, a lot of times we'll get, can my boyfriend come or can my girlfriend come? And sometimes they're a great support and they're a great advocate for treatment. And sometimes it's a blessing having them along the way. And other times it would cause more difficulty. So it is a professional assessment. It is, you know, talking to Carson, talking to the educational consultant, talking to the program, gathering as much information as we can from the families to make those educated decisions. Carson, anything to add on that?
I don't think so. I think you guys covered it.
Great. Let's see. I think that's the majority of our questions from our audience. Any other positive experience, any other stories? We all enjoy hearing stories and how it's relatable to us. So any other stories you guys want to share?
I'll share one. So a family that I had been working with for probably a year before they finally made the decision to move forward with putting their son into a therapeutic program. And we had decided to use Safe Passage based on the fact that the kid was pretty high risk and parents, for a few things, child was high risk, parents had zero ability to hold boundaries. So we had kind of made this decision, and it was interesting because throughout the kind of before communication process of updating the Safe Passage agency and staff about the kiddo and giving them all the information, I honestly, it was one that I was a little nervous about. I wasn't sure how he would respond. And, you know, the agency was great, was prepared. And the parents were also kind of with me a little anxious. I didn't share that with them, of course, but they were anxious about how he was going to respond. And like, he sees them and is like, okay, puts his stuff in the bag, gets in the car, like nothing. And so it's so funny because, you know, I feel like I've had multiple kind of versions of that where the parents are really concerned about what it's going to be like for their child. And, you know, the experience is really positive, and, you know, kind of some of those similar things as far as, can I talk to them after the fact? Can I call them from the program? Can I get their card for later? You know, all of these things where, you know, I think they want to present it sometimes in an over dramatized way. And when it comes down to it, the kids and the young adults like end up really building trust with that professional, and it goes really well. So I just am always a little astounded when it's just a kiddo that I think is really, you know, is pretty aggressive and acts out a lot. And I think, what is this going to look like? And it's like nothing, just smooth sailing. So those are always good.
Yeah. I am so full of gratitude with having a community of professionals to be able to surround our families and our clients with. You know, it really does take a village. And in today's world, we often, when our loved ones are struggling, we feel isolated, we feel hopeless. Oftentimes we feel helpless. And so to be able to bring, we have, you know, 3 different levels of professionals here on our panel that can all go around and surround that family and provide that safety and that information. And I'm so grateful for our community in that ability to really surround those families, just like you said, and create, you know, their ability to trust.
Yeah.
And I would say, I agree with that. And I've shared a couple stories, but I think an overarching theme that I believe in a lot is that young people are really capable, and I believe in them. And even though the process might be messy at first, that they're capable of understanding that what their parents did was out of love and regard and safety. and they're lost. Oftentimes they want help, they just don't know how to pick up the phone. And so once a parent makes that gut-wrenching decision for safe passage to a primary care, they are acting, I think, in a courageous way. And that young person will, at least in my experience, there hasn't been a graduation we've had that young person hasn't thanked their parent for the opportunity of treatment. So I believe in young people, and I believe that ultimately they know they're in trouble and they rely on their parents and you professionals and me to give them a passage to recovery and well-being.
Yeah. And really from that family perspective too, I believe in families. You know, our families, I think, are struggling a lot right now with everything that's going on in the world. And a lot being pulled in a lot of different directions. And it is such a courageous thing to see your child, to see your loved one, and to take action, because it's a lot easier to not look or to pretend you're too busy. So it is so courageous of our families and of our clients to really step in and lean in to this work. And the outcomes are amazing. They really are.
And kids are hurting in ways they've never hurt before. And I've been in the field since '81. And our kids they are so anxious and they're so confused. And coming out of a pandemic, they don't have the sort of resiliency they once had.
Right.
So we've got to show up in a bigger way for our young people, because we're losing them to suicide and to overdose in numbers we've never seen before.
Yes. Well, I want to end this with hope. We're running out of time, and I want to thank the two of you. It has been such a blessing to be able to share this hour with you and be able to be able to talk about this in an open forum. Lexi Spett is saying one more question. What is that question, Lexi? She said one more question, but I don't see the question. So I just want to, again, thank you both for being here. This is recorded. Please share it with anybody who has questions or needs support. Oh, the question is, what are you doing about Oregon? And I think that is a whole nother hour. But for those that don't know, Oregon has passed a law against safe passage. You have to be a licensed child care professional in the state of Oregon to be able to provide safe passage to adolescents in Oregon. And I don't think I'm part of the AMATS board, which is a board of 7 vetted professional agencies that provide safe passage. And I don't think any of us at this time are going through that process to become a licensed child care agency. So we're continuing to communicate with the legislature there from an agency, from an association perspective at AMATS. We're continuing to dialogue with many of the different state legislatures, because I think Oregon's just the first for that to happen, but we can definitely make a whole nother hour about that question.
Well, thank you for hosting this.
Yeah,
Hired Power, and Nanette, my friend, and Carson, for being the competent professional you are, and for all that attended this. You are important people to us and in this field. So thank you all.
Emily?
Well, thank you to all of our speakers. That was a wonderful conversation and so much helpful information. And thank you to everybody that joined us here today. We hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we are so glad you could join us. We will be sending the recording out this weekend, so please feel free to share the webinar with anyone you think it might help. And as always, if there's anything that Hired Power can do to help you or a loved one, please reach out to us. Thank you.